Alright, so the forest next to my house is currently being cut down to build over 500 houses, and as you can tell by my very dramatic entrance, I'm not okay with that. This forest has been subject to so many of my adventures growing up, and it just breaks my heart to see it being stripped away like that. And so I thought I would go on one last adventure and create a project to encapsulate all of these past memories before the forest is completely gone. Alright, so the idea was quite simple. I was gonna build myself what I like to call a makeshift foundry that would allow me to melt my aluminum pieces. I started by repurposing some old pieces of metal into a container that would act as some kind of basic structure to my foundry. The goal was to create a contraption capable of containing heat at a very high temperature. I had to make sure that the materials I would use would be heat resistant. And so I made a mixture of sand, plaster, and water, which I poured all around a cardboard cutout of a cylinder, making a cavity at the center of the foundry. Now, the following step required me to find some fuel for the foundry. And luckily for me, I had some leftover wood from my snowman project, which I cut down in tiny little bits and pieces. Once everything was cut, I transferred all the pieces into paint buckets, which I sealed shut and pierced a hole at the top of each can. I then transferred all the cans on top of a raging fire. The lack of oxygen within the cans forces the chemicals inside the wood to burn and evaporate without burning the actual wood. After I let the cans cool down overnight while I was sleeping in my very comfortable bed, I was left with some awesome charcoal. I started by inserting a fire extinguisher at the center of the foundry in which I would melt my aluminum pieces. I then activated my highly expensive dual system of ventilation to provide the interior of the foundry with some oxygen. The combination of the burning charcoal and oxygen allows the interior of the foundry to reach temperatures capable of melting aluminum. Once everything was melted, I scooped out all the impurities with a spoon, leaving me with molten aluminum. Now, the following step required me to melt some wax, which I would then pour into a combination of PVC pipes and plastic containers in order to create wax rings. I then smoothed in all the pieces using an oven top and connected them while they were still hot. I also inserted some aluminum hooks which would fuse later on in the process. I then inserted some needles at the top of each piece before pouring in some plaster to indicate where the piece remains inside the plaster mold. Once the plaster was partially dried, I drilled some holes to allow the wax to escape while cooking up the pieces inside a mini oven. I then remelted my aluminum pieces into molten aluminum, which I poured into my plaster molds, leaving me with a replicate of the wax models. After sanding off the excess with a disc sander, I used a rotary tool to further sand and polish the details of my aluminum pieces. Now, this following step was going to require a lot of precision, and so I asked my friend's mom if I can borrow her drill press in order to create holes all the way across my two pieces. The biggest challenge for this step was to keep the pieces perfectly aligned, which is why I'm using some gum paste to keep the pieces in place. The friction between the drill bit and the aluminum causes the aluminum to melt slightly, and so I made sure to use some grease in order to avoid any sticking. The drill press was first invented in 1889 by a guy named Arthur. So if you're watching this, Arthur, thank you, hope all is well, and have a good day. Once all the pieces were finally completed, I used a tap tool to create some grooves on all the front-facing holes in order to connect all the pieces using some screws. I've always had a hard time accepting that I'm growing up and that things around me are changing. I often find myself reflecting on the past, feeling as though my best adventures are behind me and that nothing exciting will happen in the future. And so I made these beautiful goggles as a reminder to myself that no matter how old I get or things around me change, the eyes through which I live my adventures growing up will remain the same my entire life. When I was a kid, my ultimate dream was to become an inventor. The idea of creating something from pure imagination was just so fascinating to me. And so whenever I had the chance, I would invent things. However, they would never be the way I envisioned them, and so I never considered myself valuable enough to be called an inventor. I've been achieving more and more projects over the last couple years, and to be honest, the final outcome is not the adventure I've been seeking for. I've realized that it's the obstacles and challenges that I face while making these projects that make up the adventure, and not the final outcome. What defines a true inventor is not his or her accomplishments, but their willingness to invent regardless of the obstacles in front of them. And I guess after all these years, I'm finally realizing that I can call myself an inventor. And I always have been. And the adventure is only getting started.